climate change not only is not waiting for us, has not waited for us. The consequences have already been devastating, and it's going to get worse.
Welcome to VoxDevTalks. My name is Tim Phillips. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent, so it has never been more important to increase the resilience of small-scale farmers. So what does research tell us are the most effective interventions and policies to do this? In the latest of our collaborations with JPAL to discuss their policy insights, I'm talking to Tavneet Suri of MIT. She's also co-chair of JPAL's agricultural sector, about how we can strengthen the resilience of farmers to climate change. Tavneet, welcome back to VoxDevTalks.
Hi, Tim. Always a pleasure to chat with you. Thanks for having me on.
It's always great to talk to you as well, Tavneet. Tell me about small-scale farmers, first of all. Why are they particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change?
Good question, Tim. Small-scale farmers often rely on rainfall. A lot of them have very small plots of land. They're going to depend on rainfall for their harvest or where they get the water for their crops. As climate change comes along, we know two things are going to happen. One is, much as temperatures are going to go up, the frequency of extreme events is also going to go up. So think extreme events like droughts and floods.
Yeah.
And things like that can be really destructive to farmers that depend on rainfall. Droughts mean your entire crop is wiped out, the same on the flood side. And so it's sort of the increased frequency of these extreme events will and already has hit them quite hard.
And if we do not help them to improve their resilience, how do they typically need to respond to these events? How does that affect their lives and the lives of their families?
Yeah, it's pretty dramatic. If you think of the recent flooding in East Africa, for example, a lot of farmers have to not eat, cut down food, maybe not pay for school because they need to buy food now because, their harvests have failed. Mm-hmm. So you see them engage in a bunch of these activities that are usually in some way or form selling an asset or cutting consumption in some way to be able to eat, and probably eating less than they should. You can see this in the large food insecurity numbers coming out from all of these extreme events when you see the floods, like I said, in East Africa this year, the droughts from last year, the year before, you see these big increases in food insecure regions. That's pretty bad, both for children, adults, the whole spectrum of people. The typical way they'll respond is, I'm going to have to buy food because I don't have my own food. And where do I get that money from? And I'm going to cut something else somewhere or sell something to do that.
We regularly see on the news the impact of some extreme weather events, as you say, East Africa, Bangladesh. But is this resilience a problem throughout the global south?
We see the big extreme events. That's what makes the news. But, a drought, what do we define it? Maybe 2 standard deviations below mean rainfall. But what about the guy who's 1.8 and 1.7, right? It's not 2, so he's not an extreme drought or something, but he's still hit pretty bad. I think we think of these extreme events as bimodal, an up-down event, but there's actually a distribution of outcomes, and there is variation in that, which is also not great. So I do think a lot of the global south is affected because you're just changing the distribution of rainfall, and because they're all dependent on rainfall for most of the crops. Is it bad or is it really bad? The other piece is there's some places where the timing of the rainfall is changing.
Right.
And in ways that farmers don't quite understand. Imagine the rains start early. They have to scramble to plant, and I might not have enough time to go get fertilizer or go do what I wanted to do before planting because it started raining early. And so also this uncertainty about what's going to happen to the weather is growing, and that creates compounding issues as well.
The go-to technology to cope with this has been seeds that are resistant to drought or resistant to flooding or resistant to salinity. When these are used, and there is one of these extreme weather events, how big is the impact? Do they work well?
They do work well, actually. We have a few studies. I'm going to try not to get into too much of the weeds for this, but we do find that they protect yields, both in the extreme event years as well as in other years. One of the worries about some of these technologies in the past has been maybe it does really well when there's a flood, but in a normal year, it does worse than another technology, right? And that's always sort of been one of the concerns is, do we have technologies that don't do that? And we are finding they don't do that. So we have technologies that give you about the same yield straight up if you did nothing else in a good year. And in a bad year, they protect you from the bad outcome. And this can be between 10 and 20%, depending on the context in which technology and where. But you do see yield improvements in the bad years. Sometimes you're even seeing yield improvements in the good years, which is the surprising thing.
That is extremely surprising because you would instinctively think that they would have worse yields in the good years, but you certainly wouldn't think they would have better yields as well.
And I think where that's coming from is basically when farmers know that they're better protected in a down year, they start to also change and adapt their behavior.
Right.
And they invest in other technologies. They do other practices because they know if I spend all this time doing this and it's a bad year, I'll still do okay from it. Right. And so that allows them to do more what we would think of as complementary things. And that lasts through the good years too.
What are these complementary things? In what ways are they changing their behavior?
Mostly labor time. The one example we have is spending more time in planting properly and labor-intensive planting technology. I think of it purely as time spent, right?
Right.
I'm willing to spend more time because I know I'm protected from the downside. When I'm not protected from the downside, you're just like, well, if it's a bad year, all of this goes to waste.
And what is causing farmers to change their choice of seeds? Do they go through a flood or a drought and it has a bad effect and this makes them change their behavior? Or is it possible to make sure that they change their behavior before the bad thing happens?
I think all of the studies we do, as you know, at JPAL, are randomized controlled trials where people are given the technology. So you don't often see the natural adoption decision. And I think that's been some of the newer work that people are now doing, which is to say, well, now that we know the technology works, how do we want to think about how to get farmers to use it independently of a government program or a government policy? I will say in one of our studies, I think the government in India or the state government did scale up a lot of the distribution. One thing they found in the India study was this only helped mostly farmers who were in flood-prone areas. Think of it that way.
Yeah.
And the richer farmers are going to move out of flood-prone areas because they can. And so what happens over time is the places that are more flood-prone tend to be poorer farmers, which means they're also less likely to be able to afford a technology if it was commercially available. It might be a role for government policy in those instances to say, well, we do a lot of social protection, but maybe some social protection might be good in the form of this sort of stuff, in-kind things that can generate these gains in the worst times, because it also saves you from distributing food when the drought hits or the flood hits, right? So it's an interesting space where you can say, well, we could try and study how do we get farmers to take it up, and do we get information out, and do we get the distributors of the technology to try and help us educate the farmers in the process? Or should we also think about government policy? Because it's possible that the worst hit are poorer. It's also possible that if you didn't help them when the drought or the flood comes, you're going to have to put in money into those areas as a government to help. And so how does that trade off? And that's, I think, an interesting question.
One other interesting question that's come up several times on episodes recently, the value of information to these farmers. We're getting much better at forecasting weather or forecasting the impact of a potential flood or a potential drought. Is one way to increase resilience to give these farmers better information?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been some work now looking at this in India. Can I use better forecasting of the weather? When is the onset of the monsoon, for example? That's a big one. For farmers, they want to know when the monsoon's going to start, right? My planting is tied to the rains directly. When it starts really matters. If it's already started and I'm late, then I miss the core planting time. There is some ongoing work looking at, can we build both better forecasting and can we get that out to people? And we do see some impacts of that. We see that farmers invest more as a result because they know what's happening and they can try and invest in things. There's still a lot more work to do there, trying to understand both how do they react in different contexts, different crops, different countries, different places. But it is a very promising area for where we might actually be able to both give good forecasts and see whether farmers find use in these forecasts and can adjust.
Now, another technology that you have spent a lot of time researching is mobile money, and it is now easier to give farmers who have been hit by a drought or a flood an emergency loan. How effective is this approach to building resilience?
First, mobile money itself built resilience. We saw that in our research because mobile money was mostly used for person-to-person transfers.
Sure.
So one way, we talked about how farmers deal with shocks. One way is cutting expenses and stuff. The other is reaching out to your friends and family for help, right? You reach out to your social networks. It's not ideal because your social networks live far away. There's a transport cost involved. Stuff might be happening to them, et cetera, right? It's not ideal. But we have seen farmers do that a lot. One of the things we found in our mobile money work was when mobile money comes along, those transfers just suddenly become way cheaper and way easier. The other thing was because of transport costs for sending money to someone who needs help, social networks that were helping you were very geographically concentrated. So like a bus ride from Nairobi to the average distance a transfer travels in our data is $5.
Right.
I'm sending you $5. I'm not going to spend $5 sending you $5, right? That's a big cost. So your social networks that you were using were very close to you because of transport costs. But if there's a big flood, guess what? You both get caught in the flood and I can't help you. So mobile money allowed you to access wider social networks. We do see it helped resilience immediately because it's more likely that your social network doesn't have the same correlated shock and therefore can help you. On the loan side, in one of our other studies, people are more likely to take loans when something bad happens. So it does provide something. The thing is, these loans are quite small and often quite short term. And so you have to pay it back at some point.
Yeah.
And so it feels like, yes, it can help, but thinking through how to do more longer term things would probably be good. There's one study that did sort of loans at harvest versus loans earlier. And that's also finding some effects, like the timing of the loan really matters too. So I do think financial tools can help resilience. We don't have enough work on the credit side looking at pure resilience, but more to be done.
Another intervention, which is much more ambitious and more long-term, is what are called graduation programs. These are much bigger than just increasing farmers' resilience to climate change, but how effective are they in this context?
Yeah, so graduation programs are this bundle of things, right?
Yeah.
It's a big asset, some training on the asset, some consumption, some financial inclusion. Think of it as a big package of stuff. And we're finding of the graduation programs really big impacts on just straight up consumption and outcomes and welfare, but also on this resilience piece. We do see that they're less likely to have to worry about cutting consumption at a bad time. We do see consumption is higher during a drought relative to the people who are not in the graduation program. Some of the graduation programs actually provide some resilience also through cash or food because they're providing those in the graduation program. So these are certainly helping resilience quite a bit. They're doing many things as well. They're helping you diversify your sources of income. That also implicitly could help resilience. If I'm not so dependent on crops, then I'm less worried about the floods and the droughts. I'm more resilient just by my choices of what I choose to do as an activity. We started off talking about small scale farmers, but you could say, what if we weren't all farmers? Then would we be so worried? Maybe we'd be less worried. So some of graduation is trying to diversify sources of income, which in the long term should also help with resilience for that reason.
Yes, we've been discussing mostly programs that help farmers be better farmers, but is it perhaps better for many of them to have less of their income dependent on agriculture?
I could easily say yes.
Yeah.
It is very hard to move farmers away from farming into something else. It's not just some stubborn sticking to farming. Let's be clear. There has to be opportunities in the area that allow you to do that. And in small rural towns in Africa, how many other opportunities are there? What opportunities are there to do non-agriculture, right?
Yes, you can't just walk down the road and get a job. Yeah.
Exactly. It's not like I come knock on Tim's door and go, okay, hire me to do anything you want me to do, right?
Yeah.
So I do think absolutely we would like farmers to diversify sources of income, but we don't have a ton of evidence on things that are doing that. Graduation is doing that by the design of graduation, but also for ultra poor households only, right? So graduation is a program that focuses on the ultra poor. And a lot of the assets are not crops, but they're livestock, and livestock still depend on rain, right? I mean, they still need to eat. So it's not quite the diversification that you might think, that I've got a totally non-agricultural job. But certainly that's the idea. We have a study on universal basic income that a priori I thought would have done a ton in agriculture. But it turns out people start businesses and start diversifying their income, which was unexpected to me at the time. It was not something I had expected before when we started the study. So we do see some of that, and we do see people choosing to do that when they can. So clearly to them, it's also important. But we also have to keep in mind, we need to have flourishing local economies to support this sort of move. It won't come from nowhere. And we have less understanding of how to do that and less research there. So that's a plug for more research on that side of the equation for sure.
These measures, these programs to improve resilience, you can't force farmers to be different, can you? They rely on the farmers choosing to adopt different behaviors, different technologies. What strategies work best to incentivize them to change their behavior and also change it permanently, not just try something for a couple of years?
That's a question we're going to struggle with for a very, very long time as economists. Even outside of farmers, getting people to change their behavior is actually not so easy. I do think that if farmers think something is profitable and can understand it's profitable or have experience with it being profitable for them, that's the first hurdle, right? Not just yield increasing, right? But like, if I'm going to pay for it, it better show up in profits, not just change my yields. And that's some of the issue. In some parts of the world, fertilizer is so expensive that even though it increases yields a ton, it's actually not profitable. How do we get profitable technologies to farmers? And we know that the profits for agricultural technologies vary across space and time. If I have a drought, even if I have drought resilience, I'm not getting everything that I would get in a good year. That means revenue is lower. What did it cost? Farmers need technologies to be profitable in all spaces of time for them, pretty much, not maybe all, but like a lot. If I live in one part of rural Kenya versus another part of rural Kenya, the same technology will have different benefits because the soil is different and the environment is different, etc. It's not just as one profit equation for the whole of the global south. It's quite different for each farmer. And what are the policies that can get us to making technologies that we know are good more profitable? Can I get more competitive distribution? Can I get better infrastructure to get more trade and lower costs? Improve access. Thinking about the policies that feed into the benefit and the cost side to make these things profitable is certainly a piece of that equation.
We learned that the best way to improve resilience in any situation is to provide a market for insurance. But we know that even where you are in North America, where I am in Europe, farmers are either uninsured or underinsured. Is insurance a practical solution for increasing resilience of the farmers that we're talking about?
I'm continually surprised by how many papers we have on some form of insurance. And there, people do find impacts of it. It helps farmers. They start to, again, change their behavior as well because I know I'm better protected. I'm going to make riskier investments. We also saw that in the mobile money work. In the long term, people start businesses and do riskier things. We see this in universal basic income. They're better protected because they have a basic income for 12 years. They take on more risk, right? They start a business, which is definitely risky. So we do see that if you're insured, better insured, farmers or individuals, in fact, do take on riskier behavior. The problem that they found in the weather insurance is people don't want to pay for it.
Right.
When you offer it at market prices, demand is low. And many reasons for this. There's no silver bullet. One is, do they have money at hand to pay for it? I like to give this example. Like, think of credit we talked about. If you're the bank, you're giving me a loan, you give me the money. Insurance, you come to me and say, give me $1. And every week you come to me and say, give me $1. And then when all hell breaks loose, on the worst day of my life, I expect you to show up and hand me $10.
Yeah.
If you disappear with my $1 a week and don't show up on that day, life's pretty bad. But it's pretty bad if you don't show up, right? If you're a bank and you give me a loan and you don't show up, I'm grateful. I'm really glad if the bank disappears and goes under, right? Because I got money. But if I paid you and you don't show up on the worst day, on the day I had a drought, this is a problem. So the relationship even with the provider is quite different than if it's a loan, because I'm saving with you in my mind, and I expect you to show up on the worst day. So I think the demand side has many issues. Do I really think I need it? Do I underestimate probabilities? In the US, there's a lot of literature showing we don't estimate probabilities of bad events well. Do I trust a person? Do I have cash on hand? All of these add up, and it means that demand is low. Insurance is great. It really helps people, but getting people to buy it is just really tricky because it's a tricky product.
As you've said, these are difficult questions, but the clock's ticking on this. Climate change isn't going to wait for us. What is the risk in the next decade, 2 decades, if the resilience of small farmers does not improve?
Climate change not only is not waiting for us, has not waited for us. And you see this all over the global south, that extreme events have become very high probability. The consequences have already been devastating, and it's going to get worse. I think there's no two ways around that. It's going to impose huge fiscal issues on governments to support what's going on ex post, after the event. A bunch of African governments are struggling with debt, and they don't have the money to deal with this. So that brings us into even worse territory, where the government might not be able to fund the support needed to deal with this locally. We rely on the external world, or devastation ensues. Given how bad it's been in the last few years from these devastating events, given how food insecure parts of the global south have been, it's not going to get any better, and it's going to get worse. And we've been struggling to already deal with that.
Well, let's hope that the good work that we're doing can offset some of that. But Tavneet, for now, thank you very much.
Thanks for your time, Tim. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
The policy insight is called Building Farmers' Resilience to Climate Change. The academic leads on it were Tavneet Suri and Kelsey Jack. The authors were Leonie Rawls, Gabrielle Robertson. You will find it at povertyactionlab.org. The best way to do it is to go along to that site and search for it there. This has been a VoxDevTalk. The best way to make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe, follow us. You'll find us wherever you get your podcast. Our past episodes, as always, there are a lot of them now, several including Tavneet, are at voxdev.org. And if you've enjoyed this, tell someone else about it, and then they can hear conversations like this one.